Alma Mullen stood in the ceremonial gown she had worn the day they stripped everything from her. The deep blue fabric, embroidered with silver threads that had long since dulled, hung from her shoulders like a memory that refused to fade. She had been Luna once. The pack had looked to her with reverence, sought her counsel, trusted her judgment, but that was before the Alpha died, before they decided his absence made her expendable. The rejection hadn't come with warning. One day she stood beside him, the next she stood alone at a ceremony meant to honor tradition, watching as faces she'd known for years turned away. No one met her eyes, no one spoke in her defense. They simply let her go, as if the years of service, of leadership, of standing between them and chaos meant nothing without him there to validate her existence. She wore the gown because it was all she had left of who she'd been. The ceremony that day had been her last as Luna, not because she'd failed, not because she'd faltered, but because they needed someone to blame for the void his death had created. Easier to cast aside the woman who reminded them of what they'd lost than to face their grief honestly. Alma didn't fight them. She stood there, silent, as they spoke around her, about her, as though she'd already disappeared. Her expression remained calm, her gaze distant but steady. She'd learned early that tears were a currency she wouldn't spend on people who'd already decided she was worthless. So she endured. She let them see what they wanted to see, a forgotten relic, a symbol of the past with no place in their future. Years passed that way, years of isolation, of being unseen even when she walked among them. The gown faded, the silver embroidery tarnished, but Alma didn't fade. Somewhere in the silence, in the long stretches of solitude, something in her shifted. The woman they'd abandoned had time to remember who she was before she'd ever been Luna, before she'd ever needed their approval to know her own worth. When she returned, truly returned, not just physically present, but times present, times in the way that made people stop and reconsider they didn't recognize what they were seeing. This wasn't the woman they'd discarded. This was someone who'd spent years unlearning the need to be smaller, quieter, more palatable. Someone who'd stopped waiting for permission to reclaim what had always been hers. The pack would have to face what they'd done, not because Alma demanded it, but because her mere presence asked a question they could no longer avoid. What happens when the person you discard refuses to disappear? Asterisk. If this story feels familiar, you're not alone. Stay with me. Asterisk. Chapter 1. The ceremony had been planned for weeks. A gathering to honor the Alpha's memory, to establish the new order, to move forward as a pack. Alma arrived in the blue gown because protocol demanded it. Luna, even a widowed one, honored tradition. She'd embroidered the silver threads herself years ago, before she understood that beauty couldn't shield you from cruelty. She stood at the front as they'd instructed, waiting for the elder to speak her name, to acknowledge her role in guiding them forward. Instead, Marcus the Alpha's younger brother stepped into the center of the circle. The crowd shifted, a subtle reorganization that left her standing alone on the periphery. "The pack needs strength," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the gathered wolves. "We need leadership that looks forward, not back." Alma's hands remained folded. Her breathing stayed even. She knew what was coming before he said it. Effective immediately, the title of Luna will remain vacant until a more suitable candidate emerges. No one gasped. No one protested. They'd already decided. This ceremony was just the formality, the public performance of a conclusion they'd reached in private conversations she'd never been invited to join. Her husband had been dead 6 weeks, and they'd spent that time planning how to erase her. She didn't move, didn't speak. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable for everyone except her. She'd learned to live in uncomfortable silences. They hadn't. Finally, Marcus gestured toward the edge of the gathering. "You're welcome to stay as a member of the pack, of course. We value your contributions." The pause before contributions told her everything. They valued nothing about her. They were offering pity disguised as mercy and expecting gratitude for not casting her out entirely. Alma nodded once, a small, precise movement that gave them nothing to interpret. Then she turned and walked to the back of the crowd, where shadows gathered between the torches. Let them see her accept it. Let them believe she'd go quietly. The ceremony continued without her. Marcus spoke about unity and strength and the future. Sarah, who had once asked Alma's advice on everything from border disputes to choosing a mate, stood at Marcus's right hand now, nodding along with his words as though she'd never spent hours in Alma's sitting room seeking guidance. Thomas, who'd called Alma the wisest wolf I've ever known after she'd negotiated peace with the Northern Pack, stood silent in the crowd, his eyes fixed on Marcus as though Alma had never existed. She watched them rewrite history in real time, watched them redistribute her accomplishments, her decisions, her years of service into a vague collective memory where the Alpha had done everything and she'd merely been decorative. It was efficient, really. Brutal, but efficient. When the ceremony ended, people dispersed quickly. A few cast glances her way quick, furtive looks that might have been guilt or might have been curiosity about how she'd react. She gave them nothing. Just stood there in her faded gown, a ghost haunting her own life. Elena approached as the crowd thinned. She'd been Alma's closest friend once, or what passed for friendship in pack politics. Alma, she stopped, searching for words that wouldn't sound hollow. You understand, don't you? The pack needs to move forward. Forward, Alma repeated. The word tasted like ash. Marcus is strong. He'll guide us well. Elena's voice carried a note of pleading, as though she needed Alma to absolve her of this betrayal. And you'll still be here. Still be part of things. Alma met her eyes for the first time, held her gaze until Elena looked away. Part of things, she said quietly. Yes, I can see exactly what part I'll be. Elena flinched. It's not personal. No, Alma agreed. It's not. That's what makes it worse. She didn't wait for Elena's response. She walked away from the ceremonial grounds, away from the gathered pack, toward the small cottage at the edge of the territory that had once been temporary housing for visiting allies. It would be hers now, she supposed. Far enough from the center to be forgotten, close enough that they could claim they hadn't truly cast her out. The gown's hem caught on thorns as she walked. She heard the fabric tear but didn't stop to free it, let it fray, let it fall apart thread by thread. It didn't matter anymore. None of it mattered except the certainty settling into her bones. They'd made their choice, and now she'd have to live with it, or learn to live without them. The second option was starting to seem preferable. Chapter 2. The cottage became her world. 4 rooms, drafty windows, a fireplace that smoked when the wind blew wrong. Alma cleaned it methodically, scrubbing years of neglect from the floors, patching holes in the roof, making it habitable through sheer will. The pack left supplies on her doorstep occasionally, bread, dried meat, candles, silent offerings that felt less like kindness and more like conscience management. She took what she needed and left the rest. Weeks became months. Months became a year, then 2. Time moved differently in isolation. Some days stretched endlessly, each hour a separate eternity. Other days disappeared entirely, swallowed by the rhythm of survival. Tend the fire, mend the clothes, gather what food the forest provided, sleep, wake, repeat. The pack stopped leaving supplies after the first year. She didn't know if it was a conscious decision or if they'd simply forgotten she existed. Either way, it freed her from the last thread connecting them. She learned to hunt, to forage, to preserve food for winter. Skills she'd known theoretically but never needed practically. Luna didn't hunt her own food. Luna was provided for, but she wasn't Luna anymore. She saw pack members occasionally, glimpses through the trees when they hunted near the territory's edge. They never approached, never called out. She'd become invisible to them, a ghost they'd successfully exorcised from their collective memory. Sometimes she wondered if they even recognized her anymore, or if she'd faded so completely into the background that she registered as just another part of the landscape. The gown hung in her cottage, too damaged to wear but too significant to discard. She'd look at it sometimes, running her fingers over the torn hem, the tarnished silver threads, the places where fabric had worn thin. It was an artifact from another life, proof that she'd once been someone who mattered. On particularly difficult days, that proof felt necessary. On better days, she resented needing it. The loneliness was physical at first. An ache in her chest, a tightness in her throat, a constant awareness of absence. She'd been surrounded by people her entire adult life advising, mediating, leading, connecting. The silence was disorienting, like losing a sense she'd always relied on. She'd catch herself starting to speak, forming words for conversations that would never happen, then feeling foolish for the impulse. But slowly, imperceptibly, the loneliness transformed. The silence stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like space, room to think without considering how her thoughts would be received, room to feel without managing others' reactions to her feelings, room to simply exist without performance, without expectation, without the constant calculation of pack politics. She started talking to herself. Small observations at first, comments about the weather or the quality of that morning's foraged mushrooms. Then longer thoughts, working through problems out loud, testing ideas without fear of judgment. Her own voice became familiar in a way it never had been when she'd spent it all on other people. The seasons marked time more reliably than any calendar. She learned to read the forest's rhythms, to anticipate changes, to prepare. Spring meant fresh growth and renewing the cottage's roof thatch. Summer meant preserving food for winter. Autumn meant gathering firewood and reinforcing walls. Winter meant long nights by the fire, teaching herself to carve wood, to weave baskets from reeds, to create things with her hands that served no purpose except that she'd made them. She discovered she liked creating. As Luna, everything she'd done had been functional, purposeful, in service of pack cohesion. Here, alone, she could make a bowl just because she enjoyed the feel of the wood under her knife. She could arrange stones by the door because the pattern pleased her. She could spend an entire afternoon watching birds without feeling guilty about wasted time. The anger came in waves. Some days she'd wake furious at the injustice, at the casual cruelty of their dismissal. She'd chop wood with vicious precision, imagining each log was Marcus's smug face or Elena's cowardice or her own naive belief that loyalty mattered. Those days exhausted her, but they also burned through something that needed burning. Rage was clarifying. It reminded her she hadn't disappeared, hadn't dissolved into nothingness despite their best efforts to erase her. Other days brought grief so heavy she could barely move. She'd mourn not just her position, but the version of herself who'd believed in the pack's goodness, who'd trusted that years of service meant something, who'd thought she was valued for more than her connection to a powerful man. That woman had been naive, maybe, but she'd also been hopeful. Losing that hope felt like losing something essential. But grief, she learned, was finite. You could only cry so many times over the same loss before the tears ran dry. Before you had to decide whether to keep manufacturing sadness or accept that something was simply over, finished, done. By the third year, she rarely thought about them anymore. Not consciously, anyway. They'd become background noise, theoretical people doing theoretical things in a theoretical place that had nothing to do with her. She had her cottage, her routines, her small but sufficient life. She had skills they'd never taught her and confidence they'd never acknowledged. She had herself, which turned out to be enough. The woman who'd stood in that ceremony, silent and alone in her faded blue gown, had needed their approval to feel whole. The woman who emerged from 3 years of isolation didn't need anything from them at all. That shift happened so gradually, she couldn't pinpoint when exactly she'd stopped waiting for them to realize their mistake, stopped hoping they'd come apologize, stopped caring whether they thought about her at all. She just woke up one morning and realized the cottage felt like home, not exile, that the silence felt like peace, not punishment, that she'd built a life they couldn't touch because they'd already taken everything they were capable of taking, and she'd survived anyway. Chapter 3. Alma returned on a morning thick with mist. She hadn't planned it dramatically, there was no strategic timing, no calculated entrance. She simply woke knowing she had business at the PAC Center and that she would no longer avoid it out of deference to their comfort. The path was familiar but felt different. She'd walked it countless times as Luna, usually in a hurry, usually carrying the weight of someone else's crisis. Now her steps were measured, unhurried. She wore simple clothes, practical leather pants, a woven shirt, boots she'd made herself. The blue gown remained in the cottage, a relic she no longer needed to carry. She'd changed, not in the dramatic, visible way the pack might expect, but in the way a river changes stone gradually, persistently, until the shape is completely different. Her hair, once carefully maintained in elaborate styles befitting a Luna, now hung in a simple braid. Her hands, once soft from endless council meetings, bore calluses from work. But the real change was internal, invisible, absolute. She no longer moved through the world asking permission. The PAC Center emerged from the mist like a memory. The great hall stood at the heart of it, surrounded by houses arranged in careful hierarchy, the important families closest, the lesser members radiating outward. Alma had lived in the second house from the hall. Marcus lived there now, probably. She walked past her old home without pausing. A young woman sat on the porch, Marcus's mate, Alma assumed, though she didn't recognize her. The woman watched Alma pass with curious eyes but said nothing. People rarely spoke to strangers, and after 3 years, Alma supposed she qualified. She headed for the communal gathering space, an open area where PAC members traded goods, shared news, conducted daily business. A handful of wolves were there already, despite the early hour. Alma recognized some faces. Thomas, older now, his beard more gray than brown. Sarah, looking tired in a way that suggested responsibility sat heavier than she'd anticipated. A few younger wolves she didn't know, likely new adults who'd come of age after her exile. She walked to the message board, a large wooden structure where official notices were posted, and scanned the current announcements. A hunting party forming for next week. A reminder about territory boundaries. A notice about the upcoming solstice gathering. "Can I help you?" Alma turned. Sarah stood a few feet away, her expression cautious, uncertain. She was staring at Alma like she was trying to solve a puzzle, recognition flickering but not quite catching. "Just reading the board," Alma said calmly. "Right, of course." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. Have we met?" The question landed like a stone in still water. 3 years, and Sarah didn't recognize her. Alma felt something close to amusement, though it had sharp edges. "We've met." Sarah waited for elaboration. When none came, discomfort crept into her features. "I'm Sarah. I help coordinate PAC activities. If you're new to the territory—" "I'm not new." The words hung between them. Sarah tilted her head, studying Alma more carefully. Then her face changed, shock rippling across it as realization hit. "Alma." "Hello, Sarah." You're—" Sarah stammered, recovering poorly from her surprise. "We thought, No one's seen you in years. I've been here the entire time. Alma's voice remained even, factual. Same territory, same cottage, same moon rising over the same trees. Yes, but Sarah gestured vaguely, as though geography alone explained the absence of contact. But you stopped looking, Alma finished. That's different from me disappearing. Sarah flushed. Other wolves had noticed the exchange now, were watching with undisguised interest. Thomas had frozen mid-conversation, staring at Alma like she'd manifested from air. Someone whispered urgently to a companion. The news would spread quickly. The old Luna had returned. Except she wasn't the old Luna. That woman was gone, replaced by someone Sarah clearly didn't know how to categorize. Alma could see the confusion in her eyes, trying to reconcile memory with reality, expecting subservience or brokenness, and finding neither. I should let Marcus know you're here, Sarah said finally, latching onto protocol like a lifeline. Should you? Alma kept her tone mild, curious. I'm just visiting the gathering space. I wasn't aware pack members needed permission for that. No, of course not, but, Sarah faltered, he'll want to know. Then tell him. Alma turned back to the message board, reading a notice about winter preparations. Behind her, she heard Sarah's hurried footsteps retreating toward the great hall. The other wolves maintained careful distance, watching, but not approaching. Alma continued reading notices, unhurried, as though she had every right to be exactly where she was, because she did. They'd never formally exiled her. They'd just made her life so uncomfortable she'd removed herself, but she'd never actually left the territory. Never actually surrendered her place in the pack, even if they'd pretended she had. After a few minutes, she walked to one of the trading tables, examining the goods, laid out furs, preserved foods, handcrafted tools. An older woman tending the table watched her nervously. How much for the winter squash? Alma asked. The woman blinked, thrown by the mundane question. 2 coppers per pound. Alma produced coins she'd found ways to earn them, trading her own crafts with travelers passing through the territory's edge. She selected 3 pounds of squash, paid, and tucked them into her gathering bag. Thank you, she said pleasantly, as though this were the most normal transaction in the world. The woman nodded mutely, still staring. Alma moved to the next table. And the next. She took her time, shopping deliberately, refusing to be rushed or intimidated. This was her pack, her territory, her right. She'd let them take it from her once. She wouldn't make that mistake again. Chapter 4. Marcus arrived with an entourage. He'd always had a flair for drama, for making sure everyone knew when he entered a space. 6 wolves accompanied him, all young, all strong, all carefully chosen to project power. Alma finished examining a set of hand-carved spoons before acknowledging his approach. Alma. Marcus stopped a respectful distance away, though his posture read as anything but respectful. This is unexpected. She turned, meeting his eyes directly, held his gaze until he shifted his weight. Small movement, barely noticeable, but there. Is it? I never left. No one's seen you in 3 years. People see what they look for, she said. You stopped looking. A murmur rippled through the growing crowd. Word had spread fast. Wolves were emerging from houses, from workshops, from the surrounding paths, drawn by the spectacle of the forgotten Luna standing in the gathering space like she belonged there. Marcus's jaw tightened. You left. You made that choice. I moved to a cottage on pack territory. That's not leaving. That's relocating. Alma's voice remained calm, but it carried. Other wolves could hear every word. You held a ceremony that stripped my title and made my previous life untenable. I adapted. That's survival, not abandonment. We offered you a place. You offered me invisibility dressed as mercy. There's a difference. She shifted her gathering bag, the squash inside making a solid weight against her hip. But I didn't come here to litigate the past, Marcus. I came to purchase supplies and attend public spaces. Unless pack law has changed in my absence? The question was pointed, deliberate. Marcus couldn't deny her access to public spaces without revealing the unspoken agreement. They'd wanted her gone, but hadn't wanted to formally exile her. Wanted the convenience of her absence without the responsibility of forcing it. Of course, pack law hasn't changed, he said stiffly. You're welcome in public spaces. Good. Alma turned back to the trading tables, dismissing him. A bold move, one that sent another ripple through the crowd. Luna didn't dismiss alphas. But she wasn't Luna, and she'd stopped caring about hierarchy the same way they did. Marcus didn't leave. He stood there, uncertainty flickering across his face. This wasn't going how he'd expected. Alma could feel his confusion, could sense him recalculating, trying to determine what game she was playing. The problem was she wasn't playing anything. She was simply existing in the space she'd always had the right to occupy. Elena pushed through the crowd, her face pale. She looked between Alma and Marcus like she was watching a wildfire and couldn't predict which direction it would spread. Alma, she said carefully, it's been so long. How have you been? The false concern was almost insulting. Alma considered ignoring her entirely, then decided that was giving her too much power. Well enough. The cottage is comfortable. I've learned useful skills. Time alone has been clarifying. We worried. Elena tried. No one knew if you were all right. You could have visited. Alma said it without inflection, just stating fact. The cottage is a 20-minute walk from here. Less if you run. Elena flushed. We thought you wanted privacy. Privacy, I moved to the edge of the territory instead of leaving it entirely. Abandonment is someone going 3 years without checking if you're alive. Alma selected a jar of honey from a nearby table, examined it, set it down. Let's not confuse the two. The crowd had grown substantially. Alma could feel their attention like pressure against her skin, but it didn't bother her the way it once would have. She'd spent 3 years with no audience at all. Having one now changed nothing essential about who she was or what she was doing. Thomas finally approached, his steps hesitant. Alma, He stopped, searching for words. I'm sorry, for everything. She looked at him, really looked. Saw genuine regret in his eyes, exhaustion in the slope of his shoulders. Thomas had always been decent, just too weak to stand against the crowd. Thank you, she said quietly. Because what else was there? He was sorry. It didn't undo anything, but it was more than most would offer. Things have been different, Thomas continued. Since you left, since you moved, I mean. The pack feels fractured. Marcus made a sharp noise of disapproval. The pack is strong. The pack is divided, Thomas said, surprising everyone, including himself. Half the wolves barely speak to the other half. Disputes take months to resolve. We've lost 2 families to neighboring territories because they couldn't get fair mediation. Alma felt a flicker of something, not quite satisfaction, but close. She'd been Luna for 15 years. She'd held fractious personalities together through sheer patient diplomacy. Apparently that skill wasn't as replaceable as they'd assumed. That's not Alma's concern, Marcus said sharply. She made her choice. We've moved on. Have we? Someone called from the crowd. Alma couldn't see who. Or have we just been pretending to? The gathering space went very quiet. This was dangerous territory, open challenge to Marcus's authority. But the question hung there, demanding an answer no one seemed able to provide. Alma finished her shopping, paid for her goods, arranged them carefully in her bag. The mundane actions felt subversive somehow, a refusal to engage with the drama everyone else was trying to create. She wasn't here to reclaim power or challenge Marcus or heal the pack's wounds. She was here to buy squash and honey and live her life. If that made them uncomfortable, that was their problem. She walked toward the path leading back to her cottage. The crowd parted for her, wolves stepping aside like she carried an invisible force field. She'd almost reached the edge of the gathering space when Sarah called out, "Will you come back?" Alma paused, looked back at the assembled pack, at faces she'd known for years, at people who'd abandoned her, at the space she'd once called home. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Do you want me to?" No one answered. The silence was answer enough. She continued walking, leaving them with their uncertainty. Behind her, she heard the eruption of conversation, voices rising in argument and confusion, and something that might have been hope. But Alma didn't turn around. She had squash to store and honey to preserve and a life to live that didn't depend on their permission anymore. Chapter 5. She came back the following week, and the week after that. Not every day her cottage needed tending, and she'd built a life that didn't revolve around the pack center, but regularly enough that her presence stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like a fact. The pack didn't know what to do with her. Alma didn't demand anything, didn't ask for her old position back, didn't call meetings, didn't issue challenges. She simply existed in spaces she'd always had the right to occupy. She shopped at the trading tables. She attended public gatherings. She sat in the communal dining area during shared meals, eating quietly while conversation flowed around her. At first, people avoided her section of the tables. There'd be 10 empty seats radiating out from wherever she sat, a protective buffer of awkwardness. She didn't care. She ate her food, sometimes brought a book, sometimes just sat and observed, let them squirm in their discomfort. But gradually, the buffer shrank. Someone would sit 3 seats away instead of 10, then 2 seats, then adjacent. Usually younger wolves who hadn't been fully integrated into the pack during her time as Luna, who didn't carry the same guilt or awkwardness. They'd nod at her. She'd nod back. Small interactions, but they accumulated. The first time someone asked her opinion on something, it caught her off guard. A young woman, Kara, she'd introduced herself as, approached Alma at the trading tables. "Excuse me, but you're Alma Mullen, right? The former Luna?" Alma set down the leather strapping she'd been examining. "I am. I'm having trouble with a boundary dispute. With my neighbor, over where our garden plots end and begin." Kara fidgeted, clearly nervous. "My mate says we should just give in, that it's not worth fighting over, but that land is mine. My family's. It matters." "Have you spoken to Marcus?" Alma asked carefully. "3 times. He keeps saying he'll look into it, but then nothing happens. It's been 4 months. Kara's frustration bled through her careful politeness. "My parents said you used to handle these things, that you were good at finding fair solutions." Alma could feel eyes watching this interaction. Marcus, particularly, standing across the gathering space, his attention fixed on them. This was a test. Answer the question and she'd be stepping back into Luna responsibilities without the title. Refuse and she'd prove Marcus right, that she'd abandoned the pack, that she had nothing left to offer. She took a third option. "Get a length of rope and 3 neutral witnesses," Alma said. "Meet your neighbor at the disputed boundary tomorrow morning. Have each of you argue your case to the witnesses' facts only, no emotional appeals. Then have the witnesses place the rope where they believe the boundary should be based on the evidence. Accept their judgment." Kara blinked. "That's it?" "That's it. You don't need Marcus for this. You don't need a Luna. You need a fair process and people who'll honor it." Alma returned to examining the leather strapping. "Problem solved." Thank you." Kara hesitated. "What if my neighbor refuses to participate?" "Then you'll know they're not interested in fairness, just advantage. Adjust your relationship accordingly." Alma paid for the strapping, but I'd bet they'll participate. Most people want to be heard more than they want to win. Kara left looking thoughtful. Within the hour, 3 more wolves approached Alma with variations on the same theme. Disputes Marcus hadn't resolved, problems that had lingered, tensions that had been ignored. Each time, Alma provided a framework, a process, a way forward that didn't require her direct involvement or authority. She wasn't solving their problems. She was teaching them to solve problems themselves. Marcus finally confronted her as she was leaving the gathering space. "What do you think you're doing?" He kept his voice low, but anger simmered beneath it. "Shopping." Alma adjusted her bag. "You're undermining me, offering guidance without authority, encouraging wolves to bypass proper channels. I'm answering questions people ask me. Is that forbidden?" She met his eyes. "Because if it is, you should post an official notice. Make it policy that pack members can't seek advice from other pack members. See how that goes." Marcus's hands clenched. "You're not Luna anymore." "I'm aware. I haven't claimed to be." Alma kept her voice even. "But I also don't stop existing just because you find my presence inconvenient. These wolves have known me for years. If they want to ask my opinion on something, that's their choice." "You're causing problems." "No, Marcus. I'm highlighting problems that already existed. Problems you've been ignoring because addressing them is harder than pretending they're not there." She shifted her bag to her other shoulder. "That's not my fault. That's yours." She walked away before he could respond. Heard him make a frustrated noise behind her, but he didn't follow. Couldn't, really, without making a scene that would only prove her point. The pattern continued. More wolves started approaching her, not just with disputes, but with questions, concerns, observations. She never offered to fix things directly. Instead, she'd ask questions that helped them clarify their own thinking, suggest frameworks they could use, point out resources or people who might help. She was teaching without claiming to, leading without holding authority. And it was working. Alma noticed changes in how wolves interacted with each other, more direct conversations about problems instead of letting them fester, more creative solutions being proposed. Someone started a rotation schedule for shared resources that multiple families had been fighting over for months. Another wolf organized a mediation council made up of neutral parties, basically institutionalizing what Alma had suggested to Kara. The pack was learning to function without depending entirely on Marcus's authority, which meant they were learning to function the way they had when Alma was Luna, collaborative, communicative, willing to find creative solutions instead of waiting for someone in power to fix things. Marcus noticed, too. She could see it in how he watched her, how tension radiated from him whenever she was near. He'd built his authority on the pack, needing strong, decisive leadership. But they didn't need that if they could solve their own problems. His power only mattered if people felt powerless without him. Alma wasn't trying to undermine him. Not consciously, anyway. She was just being herself, the version of herself she'd become in isolation. But that self, it turned out, was a problem for Marcus in ways the old Luna never had been. Because the old Luna had derived authority from her position. This version of Alma derived authority from being useful, from being wise, from being someone wolves trusted. You couldn't strip that away with a ceremony. It simply existed, undeniable and persistent, regardless of what title she held. Chapter 6. The shift happened gradually, then all at once. For weeks, Alma's presence had been an oddity, a disruption in the pack's carefully maintained equilibrium. But oddities, given enough time, become normal. Disruptions, if they're not addressed, become the new pattern. And the pack, perhaps without fully realizing it, had started organizing itself around her quiet, consistent presence. The moment it became undeniable was during a pack gathering called to discuss territory expansion. Marcus had identified land to the east he wanted to claim, arguing it would provide better hunting and defensive positions. He'd planned to announce the decision, get general agreement, and move forward. But when he opened the floor for discussion, wolves started asking questions he couldn't answer. What about water access? What about the existing informal agreements with the Eastern Pack? How would they defend two separate territory edges without spreading their warriors too thin? Marcus provided vague assurances. The wolves looked unsatisfied. Someone, Thomas, Alma thought, though she wasn't certain, said, "What does Alma think?" The gathering space went quiet. Alma, sitting in the back, felt every eye turn toward her. Marcus's face went rigid. This was a direct challenge to his authority, whether Thomas meant it that way or not. She could decline to answer. Stay out of it. Let Marcus maintain control of his own gathering. But then she looked around at the faces watching her, not with resentment or uncertainty anymore, but with hope, with expectation, with trust that had rebuilt itself slowly over weeks of her simply showing up, being present, being useful without demanding anything in return. "The land has strategic value," Alma said carefully, rising so her voice would carry. "But Marcus is right to be cautious about the practical challenges. The Eastern Pack has used those hunting grounds informally for years. Claiming them without negotiation will be seen as aggression." She walked toward the center, not pushing Marcus aside but standing adjacent, creating a different geometry for the conversation. "However," she continued, "if we approach them with a proposal, shared access, clearly defined boundaries, maybe trade agreements that benefit both packs, we might gain the land without making an enemy. The water access issue is real. We'd need to either dig new wells or negotiate rights to the creek that runs through the disputed territory." She turned to Marcus. "You've thought about this?" He could refuse to engage, could shut down the conversation entirely, but dozens of wolves were watching, waiting. If he rejected her input now, he'd look either stubborn or incompetent. "I plan to address the water issue after claiming the land," he said stiffly. "That might work," Alma acknowledged. "Or we could address it before, as part of the negotiation. Show the Eastern Pack we're thinking long-term, that we value sustainable cooperation over territorial conquest." She could see Marcus processing, weighing his options. If he fought her on this, he'd lose. The Pack was already nodding along with her logic, already seeing the path forward she'd outlined. "We could send a delegation," he said finally. "Propose the shared access arrangement." "That would be wise," Alma agreed. "I'd recommend including someone with trade expertise. Make it clear we're offering mutual benefit, not just asking for concessions." The gathering continued, but the dynamic had fundamentally changed. Wolves directed questions to both Marcus and Alma. He handled the military and strategic elements. She addressed the diplomatic and practical concerns. Without planning it, without formal acknowledgement, they'd fallen into a partnership that looked remarkably like how she and the previous Alpha had operated. Except this time, Alma's authority wasn't derivative. It didn't flow from being someone's mate. It existed independent of Marcus, independent of any title. The Pack trusted her because she'd proven herself trustworthy, because she'd spent weeks showing up, answering questions, offering help without demanding recognition, because she'd become undeniably useful. After the gathering, Elena approached cautiously. That was, well done. Alma studied her former friend. Which part? The territorial analysis or the public demonstration that Marcus needs help he's too proud to ask for? Elena flinched. I deserved that. Maybe. Alma softened slightly. But I'm not interested in keeping score anymore, Elena. I'm interested in making sure this pack functions. If that means working alongside Marcus, fine. If it means he and I are perpetually uncomfortable with each other, also fine. The pack matters more than our feelings. You sound different, Elena said quietly. From before. I am different. 3 years of silence either breaks you or teaches you what you're actually made of. Alma shifted her bag. I learned I don't break. Over the following weeks, the pattern solidified. Alma didn't reclaim the title of Luna that would have required Marcus to formally acknowledge her, and his pride wouldn't allow it. But titles, she'd learned, mattered less than function. She functioned as a leader. The pack treated her as a leader. What else mattered? The young wolves especially gravitated toward her. They hadn't been part of the decision to cast her aside, didn't carry the older generation's guilt. They just saw someone knowledgeable and willing to teach. Alma started informal sessions, not quite lessons, just conversations where young wolves could ask questions about pack history, about diplomacy, about the skills that kept communities functional. Marcus couldn't object without looking petty. And truthfully, he'd never been interested in that kind of work anyway. He preferred the dramatic aspects of leadership, the declarations, the strategic planning, the visible demonstrations of power. The unglamorous work of actually holding a community together bored him. So they developed an unspoken division of labor. Marcus handled external threats and major strategic decisions. Alma handled internal cohesion and the 1,000 small decisions that determined whether people trusted their pack enough to stay. It wasn't perfect. Marcus still resented her presence, still bristled when wolves deferred to her judgment. But he was practical enough to recognize that the pack was more stable now than it had been in 3 years. Disputes got resolved. Young wolves stayed instead of leaving for other territories. The fractured feeling Thomas had mentioned had eased. One evening, Sarah found Alma at the edge of the gathering space, watching the sunset. I owe you an apology, Sarah said without preamble. Alma glanced at her. Yes, you do. I was afraid, Sarah continued. When the Alpha died, when everything felt uncertain, Marcus seemed strong, certain. I thought following him was the right choice. And now? Now I think strength without wisdom is just violence waiting to happen. Sarah sat down beside her, uninvited. You came back different. Harder, maybe. But also clearer. Like you know exactly who you are. 3 years alone will do that. Alma's voice carried no bitterness, just fact. You either figure out who you are when no one's watching, or you disappear entirely. I chose not to disappear. I'm glad, Sarah said quietly. The pack needs you, even if Marcus won't admit it. The pack needs to need each other, not depend on any single person. Alma stood, brushing dirt from her pants. That's what I learned in Exile. Community isn't about finding the strongest person and following them. It's about everyone being strong enough that no one person's absence destroys everything. She walked toward her cottage, leaving Sarah with that thought. The path was familiar now, worn smooth by weeks of regular travel. She'd made this journey so many times that her feet knew every route, every stone. The cottage appeared in the twilight, small and solid and hers. She'd built a life here, in isolation. Then she'd carefully, methodically, rebuilt a connection to the pack on her own terms. Not as Luna, not as anyone's accessory or symbol, just as Alma, useful, wise, unbreakable. The blue gown still hung in her cottage. She looked at it sometimes, remembering the woman who'd worn it, who'd believed titles mattered more than substance. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone who'd learned that true authority couldn't be stripped away in a ceremony because it didn't come from ceremonies. It came from being the person others knew they could trust, the person who showed up, the person who made things better just by being present. Marcus would never formally acknowledge her as Luna again. That was fine. The pack already treated her like one. That was better. She'd returned not to reclaim what was taken, but to demonstrate that what they'd taken had never been the source of her power anyway. They'd stripped her of a title and discovered, too late, that the title had only ever been a formality. The real work, the actual leadership had always been her, just her, with or without recognition. And now they knew it too. If you've ever felt rejected, forgotten, or replaced, this story was for you. Share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe for more stories where love survives rejection, time, and silence.